Australian Indy Wrestling presents the top 50 Australian wrestling territories before the WWF bought every territory out. America was split into wrestling territories. Unlike America, Australia lacks super crazy billionaires and millionaires willing to invest daddy's money into their shows. Much like America in the 70s and early 80s, Australia's 60 wrestling companies are separated by territories and natural obstacles such as distance and the big fucking desert in the middle of the country. If you have seen enough of the local scenery, wildlife, and locals with wildlife, it's time to check out one of the top local shows around the country's capital cities, starting in Western Australia, Perth, the most isolated capital city in the world. Home of the WWE for the foreseeable future. Explosive pro wrestling dominates the landscape with 3 locations: Merriwa, Malaga, and Cannington. Followed up by Dude Where's My Ring, who preferred to run in the central nightclubs of Perth City, with Southern Territory Wrestling relocating south to the Baldivis area, and New Horizons Pro Wrestling, operating out of Kelscott and Morley. Adelaide, South Australia, city of churches and moldy grapes. When you've had enough of the bell ringing, had about all of Rundle Mall you can take, got as pissed as the pigs on the local plonk produce at the markets, then you're primed and ready for one of Adelaide's top wrestling shows. Riot City runs Adelaide, and its success over recent years has propelled it to one of the top promotions in the country, with shows emanating from the Goodwood Arena, Queenstown, and Gluttony at the Adelaide Fringe Festival. Wrestle Rampage runs central and east of Adelaide at the Lion Arts Factory and Cosgrove Hall, drawing big crowds. Adelaide Championship Pro Wrestling is currently under new management, previously producing shows at the Russian Community Centre, switching venues at the Estonian Hall in North Adelaide. The long-standing pro wrestling in South Australia in the west of Adelaide carries on with a proud history in Grenwith to the west of Adelaide. Tasmania's produce and oxygen are top shelf, with some of the cleanest living in the world. Once you've taken in the scenery, eaten a bag of apples, smelt the air, visited the Tassie Devil Sanctuary, visited the magical wall of vaginas at Mona, and broken into Cadbury's Chocolate Factory, your next stop should be Tasmanian Championship Pro Wrestling, residing in Hobart, running for over 10 years, and a territory all to themselves. Here's to another 10 years of Tasmanian Championship Wrestling. Melbourne, Victoria. Home of coffee, cafes,
Melbourne coffee, you know the go.
And Aussie rules football. When you've had enough of protests and the police, it's time to dive into the crowded market of the Melbourne pro wrestling scene. We start with Melbourne City Wrestling and Oceania Pro Wrestling, operating out of the Thornbury Theatre and Melbourne Pavilion. OPW is also running shows in Ballarat. Next, we have Adrenaline Pro Wrestling in the Frankston area, Professional Championship Wrestling out in Ferntree Gully, Renegades of Wrestling with shows out of Northcote Theatre, and Alpha Pro Wrestling operating to the north in Thomastown. Mayhem Pro busting shows out in Breakus Marsh and securing a deal with 9 Now streaming. Aus Pro Wrestling springing up in Ringwood. MXW are doing well with great shows in Geelong, with Battle Championship Wrestling in Burwood hosting international guests every month. Wrestle Rock still pulls amazing crowds to the Corner Hotel in Richmond, with Victorian Pro Wrestling operating more in West Melbourne. Canberra, the capital of Australia, is between Sydney and Melbourne, home of the Australian Parliament and War Memorial. Once you've walked around Parliament House 20 times and been escorted off the property, visited the War Memorial, had your fill of history, death, and the supposed glory of war, then it's time to do something more upbeat and lively. Slam Pro Wrestling League is Australia's fastest growing pro wrestling promotion and one of the best shows in Australia. Operating shows from the UC Refectory, the Australian Institute of Sport, and the Slam Academy showcases in Mitchell, with ICW Australia producing small shows nearby out of Belconnen and Extreme Capital Wrestling to the south in Queanbeyan. Sydney, New South Wales. Like its rival city Melbourne, Sydney has a crowded pro wrestling market. Once you've had enough of being rescued in Bondi, seen enough of the animals at Taronga Park Zoo, the sights of the Opera House, and made your way through the crowds at the Mardi Gras, make your way to one of New South Wales's top promotions up and down the coast. One of Australia's largest promotions, PWA Pro Wrestling Australia, with 4 locations across Sydney, Marrickville, Coogee Bay, Newton, and Leichhardt. All-Star Wrestling is running successful shows out of the Padstow RSL, the longest-running pro wrestling company in Australia. International Pro Wrestling has run out of 4 locations in recent history: Hornsbury, Sutherland, St. John's Park, and Australia. Australian Wrestling Federation running shows out of Blacktown, with Wrestling Go setting up camp in Blacktown in recent years. In Penrith, you can catch a Wrestle Strong Dojo show. Australian Wrestling Superstars running shows out of Mortdale, RSL, and Ashfield in recent months. The new promotion, Integrity Sports Entertainment, has started running shows on Sydney's North Shore. South of Sydney, Rock and Roll Wrestling rules the territory of Wollongong. I wonder why no one has tried to run a show out of here. You're fired. On the Central Coast, International Wrestling Australia run shows out of DY, Drifters Wharf, and Roy. Newcastle Pro Wrestling runs out of Newcastle, while Suplex runs out of the Maitland area, producing hardcore shows in Newcastle, with Suplex presenting explicit wrestling. Brisbane, Queensland, where All Elite Wrestling will return in 2026. Beautiful one day, shithouse the next, if you can dodge the cyclonic storms or the numerous reporters that come with them. Have paid your utmost respects to the Crocodile Hunters family, then you, my friend, are ready for one of Queensland's top pro wrestling shows. Queensland is one of the most cohesive territories in the world. United Pro Wrestling emanates from Fortitude Valley, with a training school based in Caboolture. Pro Wrestling League runs shows out of Chermside. Nightfall Wrestling Alliance produces shows from Strathpine, with Venom Pro Wrestling to the south of Brisbane in Yatala and Binley. Further south of Brisbane, Impact Pro Wrestling Australia produces shows out of Dreamworld on the Gold Coast. Atomic Pro Wrestling produces amazing shows to the west of Brisbane in Toowoomba. United Pro Wrestling widen their reach by producing shows in Palmview, north of their training school. Nightfall Wrestling Alliance also moved north, up the coast to Maryborough on the Fraser Coast region, competing with Wide Bay Pro Wrestling, who also produce shows from the Maryborough area. War Wrestling Alliance Rockhampton runs shows out of Rockhampton. Further, North Queensland Wrestling Alliance runs out of Townsville, with Pro Wrestling Power carving up the territory of Cairns. We finish with Darwin in the Northern Territory. top-end wrestling rules, Darwin producing shows from their training school. There you have it, the top 50 Australian indie wrestling territories. How many have you been to? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.